Colonel Korn, I'd like you to stay in the control tower.
Sir?
Stay on top of this mission. It's a tough one. I'd like to know when my boys make target.
Yes, sir.
What is it, Lieutenant Binder?
An egg, sir.
I know that, Lieutenant.
A fresh egg, sir.
Where did you get the egg?
In Malta, sir. Where there are enough chickens to lay fresh eggs for every officer in the squadron. At 5 cents apiece from the mess fund.
Yes?
With a clear profit of 2 cents per egg.
For whom?
Sir, for whomever sells the eggs to the mess.
And who may that be, Milo?
Ah, sir. Oranges from Marrakesh and pecans.
Pecan.
And in Palermo, sir, 10,000 gallons of the finest Italian olive oil. The Sicilians need blankets. It would be a fair trade, sir. There's an interested party in Sardinia. All we need is the cooperation of the countries that we're dealing with.
What countries are you dealing with?
The African nations, sir.
African?
Well, the countries in the greater Mediterranean area, sir.
Oh, I see.
So, what we have to have is an additional assignment of personnel, a little time, and a plan. I have at my disposal. I can get the gas.
Well, all right.
And if I was taken off combat duty, sir, that is just until I get this thing into operation.
But Milo, look.
I know, sir, that I'm just an acting mess officer, Colonel, but it's a job that requires my full attention, I believe. It's for everyone's benefit.
Well, all right. Take whatever you need, Milo.
Thank you, sir. You see, what I hope to do is to give the men in this squadron the finest cuisine in the entire world. That's really something to shoot at, isn't it?
Yes, Milo, it certainly is.
For those of you who don't recognize it, that's a pivotal scene in Mike Nichols' 1970 film of the Joseph Heller novel Catch-22. And Joseph Heller's original novel, which is a satirical take on World War II, was set in a fictional island called Pianosa, which was in southern Italy, in 1944. But when they were filming the film, Italy no longer looked like Italy did in 44, and so they had to send out a location scout, and they found the perfect location in a place called Sonora, which is opposite Baja California, which was an absolute pristine coast and resembled the coast of Italy in 44. There was no road that reached the place, so they reached it by boat. They then built a road. They built a 300-meter runway, and they bought 26 or 25 B bombers or whatever it is. Mike Nichols proudly walked around saying he had the 6th biggest air force in the world, so nobody should fuck with him. And he hired all Second World War pilots to perform those stunts. And we actually spoke to one who was in his 80s, and he said that scene you just saw, they did about 16 times. And he said it was much more dangerous working on the film than it was fighting in World War II. But as part of our research, these are pictures that we got from that planet. We found out that the particular plane that crashed in that scene, in that stunt, was dubbed the Mexican plane, and it was actually, it was buried on site in Mexico. And so what we did is we teamed up with the archaeological department of Mexico City University, who are amongst the best archaeologists in the world. And we went with them to the site of the film, to the set, to essentially dig up the remnants of this plane, the Mexican plane.
So that's an aerial view of the area where the film was shot. And we really loved this image in particular because it reminded us of some kind of American land art from the 1970s. Or some sort of Aztec scar, kind of remnants of some ancient civilization. And it is true that this film did leave its mark on the landscape in a very radical way. As Adam said, the film, the crew came down, and at that time there was no road to this particular piece of terrain. And it was only reachable by boat, and they arrived and they began immediately to build a road, first of all, and this runway. And one of the results of that was after they left this runway, which was immediately taken over by narcotics traffickers and then used to bring drugs into Mexico. Following that, the Mexican government bombed it in order to destroy it. And by the time we reached it, it had been completely encroached on by the desert. So it was actually quite hard to even see it there. But there were signs of it everywhere. And as I mentioned, we employed a group of archaeologists from Mexico City to help us come and exhume this aeroplane that we understood was buried on the site. They began by doing a topographical map of the area, using GPS technology to get a sense of the terrain. They looked very closely at the scene that you just saw, and you might have noticed they walked from the control tower towards the plane crash. So they counted the number of steps that were taken, and they walked those steps themselves, and they stuck a pin in the ground and they said, let's dig here. So we arrived 2 weeks after that, and to our horror, they hadn't found anything. And we looked around desperately. But we realized that actually what had happened over time is that the pieces of this plane had slowly been distributed over the entire region. And so we began this painful process of scouring every single square meter of this area, picking up tiny fragments of aluminium that had come from this plane and possibly from other aeroplanes. And each of these items was measured, photographed, bagged, and put into plastic bags and stored. And these archaeologists, we called it death by diligence. They were so extraordinarily diligent, and they took the job very seriously. And they took on this task with the same seriousness that they would have applied to any sort of artifact from an ancient civilization. And at the same time, we undertook a second sort of archaeological excavation, as well as looking for the pieces of the plane. And here you see some of the things that we found. That thing in the foreground there, that's called a bladder, and that's what the fuel is contained in, and it expands and contracts. It sits inside the wing. So these are all bits of the plane. And as well as undertaking this archaeological dig, we went to Paramount, who originally produced the film, and we asked them a simple question: where is all the material that never made it into the film? And that's a whole another story. Do you want to?
There was probably Britain's most famous DOP was called David Watkins. Some of you may know him. And he worked with Mike Nichols on this film, and he insisted on on shooting just between 12 and 2 p.m. every day, which, as you know, is the worst time for photographic light, because he wanted the burnt-out background and the silhouette of people. He felt that echoed or reminisced most Joseph Heller's kind of hallucinogenic, you know, vision of kind of World War II. But it also meant that everyone from Orson Welles to Anthony Perkins to Alan Arkin was stuck in the middle of nowhere for 6 months in the desert. And we wondered what happened to all the footage that fell on the floor that didn't make it into this 121-minute film. So, like Ollie said, we approached Paramount, and they said, it doesn't exist. And a year later, really out of the blue, what used to happen to footage like this, if it didn't contain actors that were recognizable, it was sold off as stock footage for kind of advertising. And this was all deemed useless, so it had been relegated to the corner of nowhere. And suddenly somebody chanced upon this chest, and we got this email, very excited to say, we've come across 11 hours of unseen footage. And Ollie and I were super excited. The bad news was it was all on these reels, 150 reels, some of them 10 or 15 seconds long, all archivally very important pieces, and they would not let them out of sight. So in order to assemble them together, digitize them and send us that low res would have cost $500,000. And so we asked, is there another form it exists in? And they said yes, because continuity took very strict kind of notes as to what was on each scene, and each thing was labeled. So we were sent that document, and Ollie and I did essentially a paper edit, but it was also a conceptual edit. And the way we see this project is a series of kind of extinctions. So first you're talking about the coast of Italy not resembling itself. The effect of the war, of the film on the coast of Mexico, which no longer resembles the Mexico that it did in 1969. It's now chock-a-block American and horrific Canadian hotels full of retirees drinking martinis. And so what we decided to do was to ignore anything that resembled war in this footage and to make a nature documentary. So essentially we turned it on its head, and we'll just run you through it briefly. An edit, which we didn't do because we chose not to edit it. We just received the material, we graded it, and it's played as it is. We'll play you just a few minutes of it. We chose to work with a remarkable institution that's actually a private, a very progressive institution in Mexico called Jumex. And they have two exhibition spaces. One is actually located in their juice factory and funded by the juice empire. And one of their spaces, which is 500 square meters, which you see here, is actually in the juice factory itself. And we chose to just place, besides the artifacts that we saw installed in a smaller space, we decided to put just two objects in this space. One was an original propeller from the B-25 bomber. And obviously propellers normally suck air in order to fly, and we reversed this. And we got to blow air, so it turned into a giant fan. And what you see opposite it is a double-sided projection of the film we did. And it kind of created an interesting dynamic because it actually blew the screen, and the more people that moved and the way they moved between the propeller and the screen created a kind of dynamic between those two things. This is just a tiny bit of that.
So just briefly, just a last thought on this project. The title of this work is called Dodo. Dodo being the famous creature, bird, that was, I think, the unfortunate creature to be the first bird to be made extinct by human activity. And it also came to our attention, actually, while we were working on the book Fig that Ben mentioned earlier, which we did with photo works. We discovered that the curious thing about the dodo, despite being so famous, is that there's never been found a complete skeleton of that bird. It's, when you go into a museum and you see a dodo skeleton, what you're looking at is a kind of composite made up of spare parts from different dodo birds. And bits of dodos have been traveling from Mauritius and other parts of the world for centuries, and these things have been put together in this kind of way. So you're looking at a composite, and we thought that this idea of the dodo recalled our plane that we went to find, and we found in bits, kind of, but not a complete plane. And we did have a kind of fantasy, and I think we kidded ourselves that we were going to get to Mexico and with a little brush, you know, uncover the tip of a plane, shiny plane, and then slowly excavate a bit more and reveal the rest of it. And you know, we hope that this is how much we can kid ourselves. We imagined that this thing would come out of the ground intact. And of course, that's not what we found. And I think what we found was something much more interesting than that. And thinking about the dodo bird, we recognized that there was never found one complete dodo skeleton, but there is one dodo egg in the world. And we were really surprised to hear that. And the egg had been found in a marsh in Mauritius by a sea captain, and that had then passed through several generations and ended up in a box in the back shelf of a museum in South Africa, where actually Adam and I both come from. And we thought, well, we've got to photograph this dodo egg. And we were doing quite a bit of research at that time, and we were thinking a lot about eggs. And of course, the opening scene of the clip we showed you is all about the price of eggs. And features, and it's, it's a very comic moment, but we thought, let's photograph this dodo egg. And then we discovered that in the Bauhaus, when students were enrolling as photographers in the Bauhaus, the first task was how to photograph an egg. The reason being that an egg symbolizes this perfect modernist object. It doesn't matter, which way you shine light on it. It always will behave in the same way. It's reliable, and it's this object that is also very difficult to photograph, being white on a white background. And so we found the instructions from the Bauhaus, and we sent them to a still life photographer in South Africa, who went there and photographed it. What's happening? So there you see the egg in a number of different lighting situations.